So I don't know if you know Jeff Buckley, and I don't know if you know his the band's style. That song is actually a very sort of a heavy rock song that Brad and the band adapted for this morning, and that was pretty awesome. That was really pretty awesome. I'm also surprised sometimes because I forget the songs that we choose so early in the week that by the end of the week when I've actually written the sermon, I'm like, how did that work out so well? But man, those words are right on target today, and just a good message for us to hear. I thought that was an interesting, the end of that text is something that I really like when Jesus tells the disciples, and he's been telling these stories, and he's been doing these things, right? And we see this throughout the New Testament stories about Jesus and the people following him. And I just love that question after he's talked about them. Now he says the blind are going to end up the blind. They're just going to fall, leading the blind, they're going to fall in a pit. And the disciples are like, we don't get that. Would you tell us what that means? And he's like, are you still this dull? And I decided, some people have complained about the seats in here that they're a little bit hard, so we're going to have seat cushions, and we're just going to have in there embroidered on all of them, it's going to say, are you still so dull? And they'll just be our seat cushions. Because in a way, that's not a bad way to be sometimes, to be in that state of sort of dullness, that state of sort of curiosity. And in spite of the fact that it can be frustrating to someone like Jesus, it still is a very real way of which I think we remain open to what things might mean. And that's kind of what this Jesus H. Christ series is all about. So I'll start with this little story. There was a man at a funeral, and he stood up, and he asked the bereaved widow, he said, could I say a word? And the widow smiled gently and said, well, of course. And then she motioned for him to come up. So he walked up to the podium, and he cleared his throat and said, plethora. And then he sat back down. The widow stepped back up to the podium and said, thank you. That means a lot. When I heard that from a friend over the weekend, I didn't catch that for like 5 minutes into the meal, and then I just laughed out loud. So I had this curious idea for this series because I'd been listening to a couple of Rob Bell podcasts along with the same title, Jesus H. Christ, but I've changed the title up a little bit and I've kind of diverged from where he went with it, but it got me curious about this idea about what we do in here. And someone was saying earlier, well, how did it go, with the podcast, with the blog that you wrote, and what kind of response have you heard and stuff? And so yes, I thought perhaps that the title might be a little provocative, and yes, I did receive a couple of emails from folks who were either concerned for my well-being and the consequences I might experience, or who were actually outright just insulted and offended by the title. And I also received several positive emails from people guessing what the H actually stands for, or at least curiously excited where this series might go. And I responded to all of them. But here's my thought. Jesus means a lot of things, and a lot of different things to a lot of different people. So I'm going to shake your theological, ecclesiological tree just a little bit to see what fruit might fall and then what might remain hanging because it's not yet ripe. I thought that was a pretty cool analogy, actually. I thought I'd see Linda looked at me when I said that, and she's like, what? If you look it up in the Wikipedia, you can look up Jesus H. Christ, and of course many of us know the phrase. It sort of always carries this connotation of being used as sort of a vulgarity perhaps, or maybe a bit of an insult, or at least something that represents some tension that maybe you remember growing up with when perhaps your parents were at one of those moments with you as you were growing up. My mother would say to me, she'd say, for example, Tommy, come downstairs, please. And I would say, all right, that was strike one, I'd think. And I was busy at a game, and I'm not even sure I even heard her call my name at that point. And then shortly after that, she'd say, Thomas McDermott, get down here now. Okay, I heard that, strike two, but hardly worth getting excited about. And then I heard Thomas Snyder McDermott, and at that point I realized it was strike three, and it was already too late for me. I should have responded at strike two. There's something of a panic when somebody utters the name Jesus H. Christ, something that feels inappropriate, some kind of tension. Maybe it's a sacred cow. Maybe it's something we don't know or the context in which we've often heard it, that how in the world can that be a helpful thing to say? I once told my mother that Bobby's mom used to shout the name a lot, and I asked her what the H stood for, and she said, I don't know, Henry or Harold. And Harold made sense to me since it was the name of that angel that we often sang about at Christmas time. So there's this curious etymology that it actually existed in the early Christian church, this Jesus H. Christ, or at least this idea behind it, because in the early Greek spelling for Jesus as a divine monogram, they took the first 3 letters of that spelling, and then they would use it on their vestment pocket. And Justin, if you'll throw that up here, you'll see what that looks like. It's the first 3 letters of Jesus. The Iona Eta Cairo, or oh no, Chi, and the Eta is actually sounds like an H. It's not an H, but it sounds like that, the way that it's said apparently in Latin, and so that's what ended up on the vestment robes and stoles of early Christian priests. This idea of JHC. Now, how it ever became Jesus H. Christ, of course, is anyone's guess. There's lots of interesting etymologies for that. But I want to start to take a look at just what this may mean, because it seems to me that we often find things offensive because they become distractions from what's really important. The idea of where and when we find offense in the Christian faith, from the misuse of certain words or the casual use of sacred cow kinds of words, to the uncomfortable inclusion of certain people that we would prefer not to see, or certain practices in the community that we would think shouldn't be there. These kinds of things, surprisingly, are still ongoing and contemporary problems for us. So I thought we would take a look by taking a look at Jesus H. Christ. And I hope that maybe you get a few takeaways over the next couple of weeks as we look at this. So here's my first encounter with Jesus H. Christ. I was 13. Some of you remember this story. I had a pretty disconnected and adventurous lifestyle during my early teens, enough so that when I ran into some Baptists in my high school, my freshman year at the high school cafeteria, they asked me if I knew where I was going when I died. Would I be going to heaven or hell? And I was both very aware of my current adventurous lifestyle, as well as I had no idea that there were only 2 options. One of which, when they described it, sounded pretty weird, and the other one was decidedly painful. So I agreed to attend their weekend revival, and I sort of got saved. It was a converted double-wide mobile home turned chapel. And at the end of the sermon, I walked down the aisle, and I confessed to the preacher it was because the older woman sitting next to me in the aisle said she thought I looked like I needed it. So I responded, and I began to get involved in the Baptist church. And what I had unknowingly participated in at that time, I've come to realize years later, is what is known as the Greco-Roman 6-line religious narrative. Now, you might know it as something much simpler. Anyone want to guess? The 4 spiritual... Come on, none of you have experienced the 4 spiritual laws? Yeah, really? The 4 spiritual laws. It goes something like this. We were created good, but Adam sinned, and so we have the human fall. But because God wanted to get us back, and we can't get to heaven, and because God sent his son Jesus then, who God sacrificed for us and raised him so that we could be loved again by God, and then we could have eternal life in heaven or perhaps in the other place. If we don't accept Jesus, then we get to go to that other place. And Jesus H. Christ, that literally scared the other place out of me. So I knew it was important, but I learned years later that, in fact, there's another way of looking at Jesus' life. Because you see, that the way of looking at this 6-line Greco-Roman narrative, and you'll see what I mean by Greco-Roman, was because we're looking backwards. Brian McLaren has this wonderful book called A New Kind of Christianity, and it came out about 7 years ago. You ought to check it out. But what theologians have recognized over the years is that we tend to have this backwards way of looking at Jesus, okay? And it goes something like this. Jesus Christ, as we understand Jesus Christ now, is based on Paul's understanding of Jesus some 15 years or so after his death. And then we have Augustine's understanding of how Paul understood Jesus. And then we have Thomas Aquinas' understanding of how Augustine understood Paul's understanding of Jesus. And then we have Luther's understanding of Augustine's understanding, Luther's understanding of Aquinas' understanding of how how Augustine saw Jesus. It's getting confusing. And then we have Calvin and Wesley and Newton's understanding of Luther's understanding of how he understood Aquinas' understanding of Augustine. You see where we're going with this, right? Until finally we get to Billy Graham, we get to Pope Benedict, and we get to Jerry Falwell. And we're looking back over 1,700 years of pre-critical tradition. Someone's understanding of someone's understanding of someone's understanding of someone's understanding of who Jesus really was. And it may be completely off the mark, because what they suggest is that, what McLaren suggests is that we should really take a look. The same way if I were to look at you and ask you, we're in All Saints, the same way I would ask you, if you were to look at your story, would you tell your story from the perspective of how your children tell your story? Or how your children's children tell, or how your grandparents tell your story, and then how they tell their grandparents' story. So you see what I'm saying? It's not your perspective. I'm not hearing your perspective. I'm hearing your whole life of multiple generations. Now, the reality is, for some of us, that is our story. We've been living out a story that has been sort of told to us, sort of passed on to us from generation to generation. And that's true. A lot of us live out of those kinds of patterns. But what makes a story for us more real is as we begin to interpret now who we are, and then reinterpret those experiences for who we are now. Does that make sense? So what we do when we look at Jesus' story and we look forward instead of backward, what we then see is we see that Jesus' story is a Jewish faith story. It was Jesus' faith story. And it began with creation and original blessing, and then Adam and Eve, and then on to Cain and Abel, and then to Abraham and Moses, Saul, David, Solomon, to the prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Amos, to John the Baptist, and then to Jesus. Jesus' faith story began at the beginning to where he was now. And if you look at that story, what you have instead of the fall, and this is really important, instead of that Greco-Roman story in reverse, what you have instead of the fall and this disconnect from God is what you have the Genesis story of creation and reconciliation, the Exodus story of liberation and formation, Isaiah's prophetic and hopeful story of a new creation, and then you have Isaiah and the other prophets' prophetic story of this new creation. Oh, I just said that. And then you have the peaceable kingdom that John the Baptist begins to foretell, and Jesus, who then challenges the people around him to begin to see what this story is all about. It's not at all a story of we are separated. It's a story of we don't realize how connected we are. It's not a story of our separation. It's a story of not seeing how deeply connected we are to God. And it echoes Paul's own words in 2 Corinthians 5 when he tells this diversitely challenged community, this diversified community of Gentiles and Jews, of insiders and outsiders, of people gathering in first century Corinth. And he tells them in that text in chapter 5, he says, the whole point of God and Jesus is that God, through Jesus, is reconciling the world to God's self. Do you know what that means? God is trying to make the world whole. That's the story. That's the story of the peaceable kingdom. And if you think about our own story, isn't that who we are as well? Isn't that what we actually are striving for as well? That sense of being together, of being complete, of being whole. And sometimes through our narrative, we have a hard time getting there because we're not starting here, we're starting backwards. But if we start present right now with this original sense of connection, it redefines all of our previous stories. So Jesus in our story this morning, Jesus H. Christ, is acting like a prophet, right? He's acting like a healer. He uses a kind of guerrilla theater of compassionate action to challenge the thinking of the day, to get them back to this idea of their original intention to be reconciled to God, to be reconciled to creation. So he challenges the very Levitical laws. He challenges temple law. He's practicing on a Sabbath. The peaceful kingdom, though, for him is bigger than bigotry or hatred or outsiders and insiders, and that kind of gets people upset, even today. And it's interesting, if you look at both stories, they're both speaking about blindness, aren't they? But they're speaking from a different perspective. Because the one story has people who should be able to see, but in fact, remain blinded and intransigent in their static traditions and laws. And then you have the other who's actually blind, not because he did anything, not because of sin, but was given sight because he sought it. It's interesting. Maybe belief has more to do with our persistence and humility, our recognizing that we don't know. So we have this curious compassion or this compassionate curiosity. And rather than static judgment, we are looking for a way to find connection. Seeing is not the miracle here. The miracle is that Jesus, who God incarnate, if you want to think of it that way, is one who's deeply connected with his most sacred humanity. He was forsaking religious tradition. He was pushing the boundaries in the service of compassion. Don't you expect that there was always a handful of people standing off to the side with a bag of rocks? If you were looking at it holistically, here's somebody willing to stand up for the truth, right? Here's somebody willing to speak out against hatred, to speak truth to power. And don't you figure there's always somebody around with a sack of rocks? Religion attempts to answer these great universal questions that our song Eternal Life was talking about. What does it mean to have real life? What does it mean to be deeply connected? What is the purpose of being human? What is the purpose of our lives here? Can there even be a peaceable kingdom? And John Stewart said that religion, it's given a lot of people hope in a world that's torn apart by religion. Except that that's not entirely true, because while any tradition can and often does get stuck with its own existential quagmire, as someone told me, if it's a good tradition, it pushes you beyond itself. If it's a good tradition, it catapults you past its own boundaries. Because what happens if it doesn't? It becomes stagnant and lifeless and ultimately self-destructive. The question about where is God and what are the meanings of our lives are questions that we have to be willing to struggle with. Are questions we have to be willing to ask ourselves and ask even if our tradition is meeting those needs. We need to be a little dull sometimes. We need to continue to ask sometimes. And even when somebody offends us, instead of that immediate reaction of fear, instead of that immediate reaction of judgment, because it's not really what we want to hear, it's not really what we're okay with. Perhaps even there is a place for us to practice a little dullness and to ask a question. What might this mean? So I'll end with this little story. Matt, our son, he surprises me sometimes. He was driving along. This doesn't surprise me at all about Matt. And I don't recommend you do this, but maybe try it. You have to kind of judge if it's safe or not. But my son was driving on the highway, and a woman pulled in behind him and started honking. And then she started flipping him off, angrily, just really angry, and honking the horn, and then went around him and sped off the access road, the same access that Matthew was going to take. So he went ahead and pulled off too. He didn't know what he'd done. I mean, clearly he recognized he might have pulled in front of her without realizing it or done something offensive like that. But he pulled up beside her at the light and rolled down his window. And he kind of waved to her. And he wasn't trying to go like, he wasn't trying to be smart aleck. He was actually trying to get her attention, and she waved down the window, and she said, "What?" And he said, "I'm sorry. I don't know if I did something really stupid. I may have. I drive kind of stupid, and I'm really sorry." And he said, but your reaction seemed really overreactive. It seemed really intense. Did you need to? Is there something the matter? And the woman that was next to him was her mother, and she started to cry. And then the driver, the young woman, started to cry. And she said, "My mom, it's been terrible. It's been stressful. We just left for her third chemo treatment, and I'm just beside myself." And Matthew smiled and said, "No worries. I'm sorry if I did something, but I'm sorry to hear about your mom, but I think it'll be okay. I'm hoping it will." And then I think he said, I'll even pray. I'll pray for you. Now, we don't know what's going on, right? We just don't know. There's a lot of anger and hatred out there, and a lot of self-justified racism and misogyny and anti-Semitism out there. And it's not the majority, thank God, by any means, but it's hard for us to sometimes feel positive in an increasingly abusive, hateful, and violent culture. And it can be hard to transcend our own traditions or our own beliefs or our own opinions of where we are at any given moment in order to see what else might be there. And sometimes we have to push ourselves beyond those comfort zones instead of circling up the wagons, drawing the walls in tighter. But this is what we do here. Many of us already know this. We already reach out beyond ourselves. We have this community that's open-ended and inclusive and tries to understand and holds things in tension. And we speak truth to power, and we curiously look beyond the lines of our own comfort zones and our own fear because we think there might be some redemptive moment there in spite of others, and even more importantly, in spite of ourselves. And so I want to suggest to you that whenever we hear that name, Jesus H. Christ, I want you to think, what if that means that H really simply stands for help? And then maybe also it stands for help is here.